You who have not seen it do not know what hell looks like from the top. That's what Germany looks like. That Austria looks like.
George Patton is remembered as one of America's greatest generals. His tanks rolled through Europe faster than anyone thought possible. But behind the medals and the glory, there was something the history books often skip. He wrote things in his private diary that would shock most people today. He compared certain groups of people to animals. He ignored direct orders from Eisenhower when it suited him. And the way he treated survivors after the war ended raised questions that still don't have good answers. The real Patton wasn't just bold and aggressive. He was something far darker. George Smith Patton Jr. came into the world on November 11, 1885, in San Gabriel. And from the moment he opened his eyes, the weight of his family history pressed onto his small shoulders. Everywhere he looked, he saw portraits of men who had died in battle, men whose names carried stories whispered through generations. His grandfather had commanded the 22nd Virginia Infantry and fallen at the Third Battle of Winchester in 1864. His great-uncle had died charging across Gettysburg in Pickett's doomed advance. Even deeper in the family tree stood Hugh Mercer, a brigadier general killed at Princeton during the Revolutionary War. His father had gone to the Virginia Military Institute and later became Los Angeles County's district attorney. So, as George grew up in that house full of ghosts, he couldn't escape the thought that he had to earn the right to stand beside them, almost as if the expectations in the room breathed with him and watched him as he grew. But while he carried a warrior lineage, he struggled with something that terrified his parents. Patton couldn't read or write until age 12. Words on a page refused to stay still for him, twisting into shapes he couldn't understand. His parents hid him at home because they feared people would think he was slow. The one person who refused to give up on him was Aunt Nanny. She sat with him for hours every day, reading Plutarch, Homer, stories about Caesar, Alexander, and Napoleon. His mind absorbed these worlds through sound instead of sight, and slowly, something unusual happened. While he couldn't read, he developed the ability to memorize entire passages word for word. That gift stayed with him for life. His nephew said he would sit and listen in amazement as Patton recited long stretches of scripture, Shakespeare, and Kipling without pausing or flipping a page. All of this shaped his mind long before he stepped into a classroom. Because he couldn't rely on written words, his brain learned to think in pictures. He began to see ideas as images rather than sentences. This way of thinking grew into his greatest strength. He could visualize whole battlefields like living maps inside his head. He could picture hills, villages, troop movements, enemy positions, and shifting terrain as if he were floating above them. Long before modern researchers studied dyslexia and the brain, Patton had already turned his weakness into a hidden advantage. When he walked onto a battlefield later in life, he would feel as if he already knew where everything belonged. Officers who worked beside him often wondered how he understood the landscape so fast. It wasn't magic. His mind just worked differently, and that difference helped him reinvent the art of rapid tactical thinking. Still, before he became the general history remembers, he had to endure humiliation. When he finally entered school at age 11, the other kids noticed something was off. They watched him stumble while reading simple lines or trying to write on the board. Whispers followed him everywhere. Some teachers thought he was mentally incapable. Others said he should be removed entirely. He felt that sting every day. Since he couldn't win in the classroom, he pushed himself to win everywhere else. Physical strength became a shield. Determination became a weapon. And the drive to outdo every person around him grew from that early pain. By the time he entered Virginia Military Institute in 1903, then West Point the following year, He was already building the mindset that would define him. West Point exposed his struggle again. He failed mathematics his first year and had to repeat it. Reading and spelling tormented him. Yet whenever the lessons turned to tactics, drills, or leadership, he excelled. He finally graduated in 1909, ranked 46th out of 103 cadets. It had taken him 5 years instead of 4, but he walked out already showing the fire that others couldn't ignore. While some people looked for inspiration in books, Patton looked for it in memories he believed came from earlier lives. He wasn't joking or posturing when he said this. He wrote poems describing battles he believed he had fought centuries before. Greek phalanxes, Roman marches, Napoleon's campaigns, even a Viking death. He carried lines of the Bhagavad Gita with him and shaped his worldview around reincarnation. When someone told him he would have made a great marshal under Napoleon, he didn't pause or smile. He just said he already had been. The certainty in his voice startled people. His family had seen hints of this since he was a child, and often wondered how far those memories went. To Patton, the soldier he was becoming felt like the continuation of a journey that began long before 1885. His real military life took off between 1903 and 1909, as he moved from VMI to West Point. But another piece of his legend formed in 1912, when he competed in the Stockholm Olympics. He was 26 and hungry to prove himself. The modern pentathlon matched everything he believed a warrior should master: riding, fencing, swimming, running, and shooting. He finished 5th overall, an incredible feat for an American in a mostly European field. The controversy came during the shooting event. Patton used a .38 service revolver, while others used smaller calibers. His bullets tore wide holes in the target, and judges said one shot had missed entirely. Patton insisted it had gone through the same hole as a previous shot. The judges couldn't prove it either way, so they marked it as a miss. That ruling cost him a medal. Still, when he returned home, he quietly boosted his shooting scores in official paperwork because 5th place didn't sit well with him. That Olympic fire led him deeper into Europe. In 1913, he sought out the greatest swordsman he could find and landed in France at the cavalry school in Saumur. There he trained under Charles Cléry, a master fencer known across the continent. Patton studied the pure offensive mindset of French cavalry. Hearing stories of Napoleon shouting to his men to thrust rather than cut. Those lessons changed everything for him. The idea that aggression wins battles settled deep inside him and stayed there for the rest of his life. When he returned to Fort Riley as master of the sword, he used those lessons to design the M1914 cavalry saber, a straight thrusting blade that carried his name. He wrote the Army's training manual in 1914 and pushed until his sword was officially approved. More than 128,000 of them were produced, though they never saw real combat. Machine guns had made horseback charges a relic, yet the spirit behind that sword left a mark on the Army's approach to offense. By 1916, Patton found himself riding alongside General John Pershing on the hunt for Pancho Villa. What started as a simple errand to buy corn for horses ended with Patton leading 10 men in 3 cars toward a ranch where Villa's fighters were hiding. A gunfight broke out, and in the chaos, Patton killed Julio Cardenas, one of Villa's top commanders. Patton strapped the bodies to the hoods of the cars and raced back to camp with the pride of a man who had proved something to himself. It became the first motorized attack in United States military history, and the moment cemented Patton's belief that boldness mattered more than caution. That belief carried him straight into World War I. In 1917, Pershing selected him to help create America's first tank corps, even though Patton ranked 113th among cavalry captains and had never seen a tank in combat. The promotion pushed him from captain to major, and then to lieutenant colonel in a rapid leap. Patton built the training program from nothing, teaching himself as he taught others. After just 1 month of studying tanks in France and Britain, he wrote a tactical paper that predicted how tanks would fight for decades. He understood their future before most generals even understood their present. He believed tanks should rush toward breakthrough points and crush the enemy before they could recover. That paper later looked prophetic when his armored divisions tore through Europe in 1944 and 1945. He didn't stay behind a desk. On September 12, 1918, he personally led 144 Renault tanks into the Battle of Saint-Mihiel. He walked ahead of them, moved through rifle fire, and rode on a tank turret as bullets hit the steel around him. His tanks pushed forward until fuel shortages stopped them. His superiors scolded him for leaving his command post, but he didn't care. He believed the men needed to see him in the fight. 2 weeks later, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, a bullet ripped through his left leg while he led another advance. 5 men around him died instantly. He lay in a shell hole bleeding while still shouting orders for more than an hour. His orderly Joe Angelo stayed by him and kept him alive long enough for rescue. The war ended on Patton's 33rd birthday, while he was recovering in the hospital. By the end of the war, he had risen from captain to full colonel in just 1 year. He had built America's first tank brigade, led it into battle, nearly died doing it, and earned both the Distinguished Service Cross and Distinguished Service Medal. His rise seemed unreal for someone who once struggled to read a single word. Yet every step of the journey showed how his mind, shaped by dyslexia, shaped by humiliation, shaped by impossible expectations, had built a soldier who could see the battlefield in ways others couldn't. Patton's story in North Africa began the moment American troops touched the shores of Morocco on November 8, 1942. He commanded the Western Task Force with 35,000 men, and as they moved toward Casablanca, everyone expected a quick victory. But instead of cheering crowds, the Americans were met by Vichy French troops still loyal to Marshal Pétain. Within 2 days, the naval fight turned brutal. French ships like Commandant de Lage, La Gracieuse, and La Cervanaise rushed out of the harbor on November 10th and opened fire. Their attacks stunned the Americans and even pushed them back for a short while. Then USS Augusta and the destroyers answered with overwhelming fire that forced the French back into the harbor. Commandant de Lage was hit, 5 men died, and the fight kept growing darker. By the time Casablanca fell, 526 Americans and 1,346 Vichy French were dead. Those 3 days showed the world that the United States could carry out complex amphibious attacks. And they showed Patton how to shape the kind of aggressive style he would soon become famous for. While the guns were still cooling in North Africa, something else was happening across the sea. Hitler learned that Vichy France surrendered after only 3 days and saw it as betrayal. His fury boiled so quickly that he ordered Operation Anton almost immediately. By the night of November 10, 1942, German and Italian forces had quietly completed their preparations. At dawn on November 11th, tanks rolled over the demarcation line and pushed toward the Mediterranean. The 1st German Army moved from the Atlantic near the Spain border, while the 7th Army surged from central France. French soldiers of the 26th Infantry Regiment stood by helplessly. They were ordered not to resist. The entire 100,000-man French Armistice Army was demobilized within hours. By evening, Hitler held all of France in his hands, and the Vichy regime lost its last traces of independence. 3 months later, Patton inherited an army shattered by humiliation. In February 1943, Rommel's Afrika Korps crushed the Americans at Kasserine Pass. It happened in 48 hours, leaving over 6,000 Americans dead or wounded. They lost 100 tanks, 55 heavy guns, and 80 trucks, while Rommel lost only about 2,000 men. By March 6th, Eisenhower had seen enough. General Fredendall was removed, and Patton was brought in. He arrived with the force of a storm. Within half an hour, he dismissed an officer for sitting at a desk without a helmet. His first official order required helmets and full combat gear at all times, even when using the latrine. He did not just rebuild tactics. He rebuilt the soldiers themselves, pushing them to see themselves as fighters who could stand against the same Germans who had just crushed them. Soon, every part of the army felt Patton's discipline. Soldiers were fined $25 if they failed to wear leggings or neckties. Officers faced the same treatment. Bradley later said that every piece of clothing Patton forced on them reminded them that the days before Kasserine were gone. Patton roared around units in scout cars with giant stars painted on the sides and a siren that warned everyone he was coming. His reputation grew, but so did the anger. Soldiers muttered that old blood and guts really meant their blood and his guts. Yet despite the bitterness, something was changing inside the two corps. They were becoming sharper, stronger, and far more dangerous. That transformation appeared clearly at El Gueter on March 23, 1943. At 3 in the morning, the 10th Panzer Division launched a massive armored attack. German tanks advanced in lines of 12 or more, punching through American positions in a three-sided sweep. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion held its ground with 31 M3 destroyers and waited for the right moment. Then the German tanks rolled straight into a minefield, losing 8 at once. That single moment gave the Americans everything they needed. Tank destroyers and artillery opened fire with everything they had. By the time the sun was fully up, 30 German tanks were destroyed out of 52 armored vehicles knocked out. The Germans retreated by 9:30 a.m. The price was high. 14 Americans were dead, and 21 of the 31 Fremen, or threes, were lost. But when Lieutenant John Yowell walked back with the men believed dead, the handshakes and backslaps said it all. The Americans had proved they could fight the Wehrmacht and win. A few months later, the invasion of Sicily brought Patton back into the center of the war. On July 10, 1943, his 7th Army landed on the beaches near the Gulf of Gela, while Montgomery struck the east. Patton's eyes were already locked on Messina. He wanted to reach it before the British to show the world how far American strength had grown. When Montgomery's plans forced him westward on July 23rd, Patton ignored it and drove his forces forward in a rapid dash. His 3rd Division covered 100 miles in 72 hours and captured Palermo on July 22nd. By August 17th, Patton entered Messina ahead of Montgomery. The victory felt enormous, but before the cheers could settle, everything changed. On August 3, 1943, Patton visited the 15th Evacuation Hospital and saw Private Charles Coole sitting among wounded men. When Coole said he was nervous and exhausted, Patton snapped and hit him with his gloves. He dragged him to the tent entrance and kicked him out. A week later, he did it again. On August 10th, he confronted Private Paul Bennett, who could barely speak through fear and exhaustion. Patton struck him twice, waved a pistol in his face, and threatened to have him shot. Bennett had been shattered after watching a friend wounded 4 days earlier. The staff who witnessed it were horrified. They filed reports within hours. Pain traveled up the chain of command. By August 17th, the same day Patton entered Messina, Eisenhower sent him a private letter that cut like a blade. Eisenhower told him that harsh measures might be necessary, but brutality and loss of control in front of subordinates would never be tolerated. He ordered Patton to apologize to both soldiers, every witness, and eventually the entire 7th Army. Eisenhower hid the story from the public, believing Patton's military skill was still vital. But he also warned that one more incident would end his career forever. Everything remained quiet until November 21, 1943. At exactly 7 p.m. Eastern Time, radio host Drew Pearson stunned millions by revealing Patton had slapped soldiers and been severely reprimanded. Congress reacted immediately. Secretary of War Henry Stimson had to address it publicly by November 26th. The fallout was severe. Patton lost his chance to lead the invasion of Italy. Worse, he was passed over for the D-Day command itself. His career dimmed at the moment when he expected to rise highest. But something unexpected happened next. Instead of being fired, Patton was given a role that looked like punishment, but became one of the most important deceptions of the war. Starting January 26, 1944, he became commander of the 1st U.S. Army Group, a force that did not exist. More than 150,000 phantom soldiers were supposedly under him. Inflatable tanks sat in fields. Plywood planes stood on fake runways. Radio operators broadcast signals from underground tunnels near Dover. The Army even designed official patches for divisions that never existed. This was Operation Fortitude, the shield that protected the real D-Day landings. The Germans believed Patton more dangerous than any other commander. They saw him in Kent and became certain he would lead the main invasion at Pas-de-Calais. That belief held so strong that Hitler kept between 150,000 and 250,000 troops frozen there for 43 days after D-Day. Even when the real attack came on June 6, 1944, German intelligence still waited for Patton. Double agents like Juan Pujol Garcia fed them constant reports of his inspections and movements. Local newspapers printed fake stories about imaginary units. Reconnaissance photos captured rows of fake landing craft built from oil drums and pipes. Every detail strengthened the lie and left German divisions waiting for an attack that never came. Finally, on July 28, 1944, Patton received a real command again. The Third Army surged forward into France and moved so fast it stunned even Eisenhower. Patton's diary reflected his restless drive, noting that his worries were more about relationships with other commanders than the Germans themselves. His army advanced from Avranches to Argentan in 2 weeks, covering 60 miles. By mid-August, he boasted that the Third Army had moved further and faster than any army in history, roughly 300 miles in total. German defenses collapsed under the speed of his attack. The only thing that could slow him down was fuel. By August 28, 1944, the Third Army needed 5,500 tons of supplies every day. They used 450,000 gallons of gasoline and 10,000 gallons of diesel daily. Eisenhower had to make a choice, and he sent the fuel north. Patton's forces began running dry. On September 2nd, gasoline allocation dropped to 25,000 gallons, barely enough to move anything. Units froze in place across Lorraine. Patton ordered his commanders to reach the Meuse River before every drop vanished. They made it just in time. The halt frustrated him deeply, but nothing could take away the fact that by VE Day on May 8, 1945, the Third Army had captured over 80,000 square miles. The war kept exposing darker chapters as well. On July 14, 1943, near the Santo Pietro airfield, Sergeant Horace West received prisoners to escort. He had watched many friends die in the previous days. Rage overtook him. He marched the prisoners outside the airfield, separated a few for intelligence, borrowed a Thompson submachine gun, and shot 37 men. He reloaded and fired again into anyone still moving. Investigators confirmed each man was shot at close range. That same afternoon, Captain John Compton ordered the execution of 36 more prisoners at the opposite end of Biscari airfield. His platoon had suffered heavily from snipers. When captured men arrived, he believed they were the same snipers. He ordered 11 soldiers to form a firing squad. All 36 prisoners were killed. The next day, July 15th, Bradley told Patton what had happened. Patton's diary revealed a cold response. He advised Bradley to have an officer certify that the prisoners were snipers or had attempted escape to avoid trouble with the press. Bradley refused. The Inspector General later proved there had been no provocation. Only then did Patton say, "Try the bastards." Court-martials followed. Patton's earlier speeches were brought up, especially the one where he told troops that if the enemy fought within 200 yards, and then tried to surrender, that man would die. Both West and Compton claimed they believed they were acting under those instructions. Patton denied ever suggesting such a thing. Investigators cleared him. West was sentenced to life in prison, but secretly released after 14 months and sent back to combat. His court-martial remained classified for nearly 50 years. He later returned home unnoticed and died in 1994 at age 81. People who knew him never realized what he had done. The moment the calendar turned to December 16, 1944, the cold air over the Ardennes carried a kind of stillness that felt almost harmless. And yet at 5:30 in the morning, everything shattered. Hitler unleashed more than 200,000 German troops and close to 1,000 tanks straight through a thin stretch of forest that the Allies thought was safe. It was a 75-mile line guarded by only 80,000 tired and inexperienced American soldiers who had been placed there to rest. Hitler had been waiting for this moment since September 16th, planning it in secret and hoping to recreate the shock of his 1940 breakthrough in the same woods. The attack pushed so hard and so fast that within days, German armored divisions surrounded the town of Bastogne, cutting off the 101st Airborne and the units fighting beside them. By Christmas Eve, Allied strength grew to more than 500,000. But those trapped inside Bastogne knew that without immediate help, they were staring at something close to certain death. The German push bent the Allied line so far that it formed a giant bulge, a wound that threatened to split British and American forces apart. As the fighting grew worse, something urgent moved behind the scenes. On December 18th, General Omar Bradley reached out to Patton and told him that Eisenhower wanted him in Verdun the next morning at 10. Patton heard the request and understood in a single instant that this was now a crisis so serious, Eisenhower was stepping in personally. Even before he left for the meeting, Patton called in his senior officers and predicted exactly what Eisenhower would ask him to do. He said they would need to stop their current operations and turn the entire Third Army north to strike back. When Eisenhower finally asked him how soon he could attack, Patton made a promise no one expected. He said he would disengage his forces, turn them 90 degrees, move more than 100,000 troops and 133,000 vehicles across 125 frozen miles and attack Bastogne in only 48 hours. The room went silent. Many officers doubted the idea was even physical reality. Eisenhower studied him, knowing that everything now depended on whether Patton could turn that promise into movement. Then the clock began ticking. From December 20th to 22, Patton's army performed what many historians still call the greatest logistical achievement of the war. They moved 250,000 men, thousands of tanks and guns, and those same 133,000 vehicles through a winter Europe hadn't seen in decades. Ice covered everything. Snow buried what passed for roads. Yet Patton's supply teams still pushed 400,000 gallons of gasoline forward each day. German officers had calculated that moving an armored division 100 miles in winter needed at least a week. Patton's forces did it in 2 days. His headquarters split into 2 groups and worked non-stop, while units tried to move through blizzards and endless traffic jams. Engineers even built airstrips in only 72 hours, so planes could take off the moment the sky cleared. The only reason any of this worked was because Brigadier General Maddox and the Third Army staff had quietly built emergency plans a week earlier. German commanders later admitted they had never expected American logistics to outrun their attack. Inside Bastogne, the pressure reached its highest point on December 22nd. That morning, 4 German soldiers walked toward the American lines with a white flag and a surrender ultimatum. They carried a message from General von Luttwitz, promising total annihilation from artillery and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions if the Americans did not give up within 2 hours. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, read the message and laughed. His reply came out of him so naturally that staff officers immediately knew it was perfect. He simply said, "Nuts." Colonel Harper delivered it to the German officers in the same blunt style. They were confused and walked away without understanding what the word meant. Inside the town, the conditions kept getting worse. The Americans were outnumbered 3-1, boxed in, freezing, and running out of supplies. Air support couldn't reach them because the weather refused to clear. Yet, that single word spread through the ranks and gave them something to hold on to. 4 days later came the moment they had been waiting for. On December 26th at 4:50 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams pushed through the last German positions in his Sherman tank Cobra King. Darkness had settled when his forward elements finally touched the lines of the 101st, ending a 7-day siege that had nearly crushed them. A German general watching from outside Bastogne saw something that seemed impossible to him. He watched American tanks arriving from a direction they believed no vehicle could cross in winter. Patton picked up the phone and called Eisenhower with only 4 words: "We're through to Bastogne." By the end of the battle, his reputation rose higher than any other Allied commander. Bradley's forces had broken badly. First Army operations under Courtney Hodges had fallen apart. Montgomery later took credit he didn't deserve, even though British casualties barely reached 1,000. Patton's counterattack shattered German strength, destroyed hundreds of vehicles, and killed or captured thousands, giving the Allies the edge they needed to win. Yet behind Patton's battlefield, legend lived a darker truth. On November 2, 1944, he spoke to the all-black 761st Tank Battalion and gave them a fierce speech. He told them he had nothing but the best in his army and cared only that they could kill the enemy. The men stood proud, believing he respected them. But that same day in his diary, he wrote that he had no faith in the fighting ability of their race. He had already grumbled when the War Department informed him that only a colored battalion was available. And although his public speech sounded inspiring, his private words showed how deep his prejudice ran. The 761st proved him wrong in every possible way. They fought 183 straight days without rest. No other American armored unit in Europe stayed in combat that long. During that time, they inflicted more than 130,000 casualties on German forces. They fought in 4 major campaigns, including the Bulge. Their losses were heavy: 34 men killed, 202 wounded, 71 tanks destroyed. Yet their record carried a list of honors few units could match. 1 Medal of Honor, 11 Silver Stars, 56 Bronze Stars, almost 300 Purple Hearts. In a brutal 72-hour stretch, they smashed through the Siegfried Line, where defenses were stronger than anywhere else on the Western Front. Even after all this, Patton never publicly admitted how wrong he had been. That same unwillingness to see human suffering followed him after Germany surrendered. In May 1945, he became military governor of Bavaria. Within months, he ignored denazification orders that required Nazi party members to be removed from power. On September 22nd, he held a press conference that became a disaster. When asked why Nazis still ran Bavarian offices, he compared it to a regular American political fight and claimed that 98% of party members had been forced to join. He said he never believed in the denazification program. When asked about reactionary Nazis still in charge, he snapped back and asked if the reporters preferred communists instead. His comments hit newspapers the next day and caused national outrage. Behind the scenes, he kept Nazi officials in power, even when Eisenhower ordered them removed. He told his officers to keep whoever they needed and ignore everything else. As a result, whole departments stayed in the hands of people who had served Hitler. Even worse, he allowed Nazi prisoners of war to be housed alongside Jewish Holocaust survivors in the same camps. Survivors who had just escaped torture now lived behind barbed wire next to the men who had persecuted them. Patton defended the decision by insisting former Nazis were necessary for order and that Jewish survivors could not be trusted to live freely. When he visited displaced persons camps, his private writings became even more disturbing. He described Jewish survivors as lacking human qualities and wrote that they preferred to relieve themselves on the floor. He called them locusts. He said they were lower than animals. He claimed they were not human beings. His diary echoed Nazi terminology. Local conditions matched his attitude. Survivors in his territory lived in overcrowded camps, surrounded by guards and barbed wire. Food was scarce. Sanitation almost non-existent. Winter clothing was inadequate. Thousands died from disease and malnutrition in the months after liberation. Reports reached Washington, and President Truman sent Earl Harrison to investigate. Harrison's findings were brutal. He wrote that America was treating Jews almost the same way the Nazis had, except without killing them. He warned Eisenhower that Germans watching this could believe the United States approved of Nazi policy. The report hit the press on September 30th, 1945, and the outrage was immediate. Combined with Patton's disastrous press conference, his removal became unavoidable. On October 2nd, Eisenhower stripped him of command and reassigned him to a small office in Bad Homburg to work on war history. His career ended that day. 2 months later came the day that still draws questions. On December 9th, 1945, at 11:45 in the morning, Patton rode in a 1938 Cadillac near Mannheim on his way to a hunting trip. His teenage driver had just crossed railroad tracks and tried to pass a military police car. A 2.5-ton army truck suddenly turned left without signaling. There was no space to avoid the crash. The Cadillac hit the truck's side, crumpling the right front fender. The impact threw Patton forward, and he struck his head hard against the partition or the clock behind the seat. His nose broke, his scalp tore, his neck snapped. He was instantly paralyzed. The others in the car walked away with only light bruises. The injury puzzled doctors and investigators. The collision was slow, the damage small. Patton's injuries catastrophic. Photographs even show the truck driver smiling at the scene, unaware of the severity. Lieutenant Babalas concluded that both drivers were at fault, but Patton himself asked him not to blame anyone. The mismatch between the light damage and the devastating injury fed decades of theories that something else had happened. For 12 days, Patton lay paralyzed in a hospital in Heidelberg. His wife arrived with a neurosurgeon, and for a short time, Patton showed signs of improvement. On December 19th, doctors believed he was stable enough to fly home. But early on December 20th, he suddenly struggled to breathe. His chest could not clear fluid, and a blood clot likely moved into his lungs. By the evening of December 21st, he died quietly. He was 60.